Keanu Reeves, disguised as homeless man. What happens next will leave you speechless. The city was alive that evening, its hum softened by a misty drizzle that turned the streetlights into golden orbs, blurred and glowing. Downtown Los Angeles looked beautiful from afar, a sprawling metropolis of opportunity and charm. But up close, its corners told quieter stories. Hidden on one of those forgotten streets, where foot traffic rarely lingered, stood Maria's kitchen. It wasn't glamorous, not by any measure. Its charm lay instead in the warmth of familiarity: checkered tablecloths, handwritten menus chalked above the counter, and Maria herself, a woman who treated strangers like family. That night the little restaurant bustled. The air carried the comforting scent of garlic and tomatoes, wrapping around families and couples who talked softly over plates of steaming pasta. Maria, a sturdy woman with lines on her face that told her own unspoken tales, moved behind the counter with grace and precision. She greeted every customer with a smile, the kind that made you feel seen, as though you mattered. To Maria, this wasn't just a restaurant. It was a place for humanity to feel whole. Outside, unnoticed against the hum of the evening, stood a man. He was huddled against the chill, his silhouette obscured by a weathered trench coat and a ragged beanie pulled low over his brow. His shoulders slumped under the weight of years, or perhaps just the weight of today. People hurried past him without pause. To the world, he was invisible, just another figure lost to misfortune. The man stared at the restaurant window, his breath fogging the glass as he watched. Inside, a little boy laughed as his mother wiped marinara sauce from his chin. An elderly couple clinked their glasses together, sharing a quiet toast. The man watched it all with tired eyes. Then, with a deep breath, he turned toward the door and stepped inside. For the briefest moment, the room quieted. It wasn't something anyone did consciously. But when a man, who looked like he'd been sleeping on the street, walked into a place like Maria's kitchen, people noticed. Some looked away quickly, embarrassed by their instinct to stare. Others exchanged glances that said far too much. The man didn't acknowledge any of it. Instead, he shuffled to the counter, his head lowered, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his coat. Maria looked up. Her smile faltered for the first time that night, but it wasn't out of judgment. No, it was something else, something softer, like sadness. "Can I help you, sir?" she asked, her voice kind but cautious. The man cleared his throat, his voice quiet and uneven. I don't have much money," he muttered, pulling a small handful of coins from his pocket and setting them on the counter. They clinked faintly, the sound painfully small against the backdrop of the bustling restaurant. "But I'm hungry. Is there anything I could buy with this?" Maria glanced at the coins, worn nickels and pennies, no more than $1, and then back at him. His hands shook as they hovered near the counter, and for a moment, Maria's heart ached. She thought of all the stories people carried, unseen and unheard. She thought of the hundreds of meals she'd served in her lifetime and the faces she couldn't forget. "Don't worry about the money," she said gently, leaning in slightly. "Sit down. I'll bring you a hot meal." The man's eyes flickered up to hers. In that split second, Maria saw something buried deep: gratitude, shame, and maybe even hope. He nodded mutely, his shoulders still hunched, and shuffled to a corner table near the window. He didn't look around or meet anyone's gaze. Instead, He stared down at the tabletop, his hands clasped tightly together as though trying to hold himself steady. Maria moved quickly, ladling spaghetti onto a plate and adding an extra helping of meatballs. She set a slice of warm garlic bread beside it and poured a glass of water. It wasn't much, but it was what she could give. As she set the meal in front of him, she smiled softly. "Eat up. Let me know if you need anything else." "Thank you," the man whispered, his voice rough. He picked up his fork, his movements careful and deliberate, as though he was afraid the moment might be snatched away. Around him, the room buzzed again, but not like before. A couple near the door leaned close, their voices hushed but audible. "I hope he doesn't try to beg from us after this." A group of teenagers laughed softly, their eyes darting to the corner table with amusement, and a man in a sharp suit muttered to his companion, "This place needs better standards. You let one in, and next thing you know..." Maria heard them all. Her hand tightened around the handle of the water pitcher she held. She'd run this restaurant long enough to know the cruel ways people looked at the world. She exhaled sharply, choosing her words. "Everyone's welcome here," she said firmly, her voice carrying just enough weight to silence the murmurs. "If you can't see that, you're in the wrong place." The man didn't look up. He kept eating, slowly, savoring each bite. For a long while, nothing happened. Maria returned to her work. The diners resumed their conversations. The room settled into its rhythm again, albeit with a little more discomfort hanging in the air. But the man in the suit didn't let it go. He stood suddenly, the legs of his chair scraping loudly against the floor. The noise made heads turn as he strode toward the corner table. He stopped just in front of the man, towering over him. "I don't know what your deal is," the suited man said, his voice dripping with disdain. "But people like you shouldn't be here, making the rest of us uncomfortable." Before the man could respond, Maria's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "That's enough." The suited man turned sharply, his brows furrowing. Maria stood behind him, her posture straight, her voice unwavering. "This man has done nothing wrong," she said, her eyes fierce. "He came here for a meal, and I gave it to him. If you have a problem with that, you're welcome to leave." The suited man opened his mouth as though to argue, but something in Maria's expression stopped him. He scowled, muttering something under his breath as he turned on his heel and stormed out. The bell above the door jingled as it shut behind him. For a moment, silence stretched across the room. Then, the man at the table stood up. He moved slowly, pulling the beanie from his head as he did. The room froze. The whispers began anew, low and disbelieving. Maria stared at him, confusion flickering across her face. The man set his beanie down gently on the table and ran a hand through his dark hair. Then he looked up. Gasps rippled through the restaurant. It was him, Keanu Reeves. The recognition hit like a shockwave. People who had been whispering just moments before now stared with wide eyes, their embarrassment written all over their faces. The teenagers fell silent. A mother clutched her child's hand as if to stop them from blurting something. Keanu's voice, calm but full of something deeper, finally broke the quiet. "You passed the test," he said softly, turning to Maria. Maria blinked, stunned. "What?" Keanu smiled faintly, the kind of smile that seemed to carry years of wisdom behind it. "You showed kindness when it wasn't easy. You defended someone you thought was vulnerable. He paused, his gaze meeting hers. That's the kind of compassion the world needs more of. Maria's face turned red with surprise, her hands pressing against her apron, as though trying to steady herself. I didn't do it for recognition, she whispered. I did it because it was the right thing to do. Keanu reached into the pocket of his coat and pulled out a small envelope. He handed it to her with a nod. I know, but you deserve this. Maria's hands shook as she took it, glancing inside. She gasped softly, her eyes filling with tears. It was a check for more money than she'd ever seen in her life. Enough to keep Maria's kitchen afloat for years. She looked up at Keanu, her voice breaking. I don't know what to say. Just keep doing what you're doing, Keanu said quietly. Around the room, the diners shifted uncomfortably, their earlier judgment hanging over them like a weight. A few began to murmur apologies, but Keanu held up a hand. It's not about apologizing to me, he said, his voice firm but kind. It's about how you treat people every day, no matter who they are. With that, he nodded to Maria one last time and turned to leave, pulling his beanie back on as he stepped out into the night. The drizzle had stopped, but the mist still hung in the air, swirling around him as he walked away. Inside, Maria clutched the check to her chest, her tears flowing freely now. Around her, the restaurant buzzed with quiet reflection. The man they'd ignored, judged, was gone. And in his place, he'd left something far more valuable than money. A lesson. In the days and weeks that followed, Maria's kitchen became something more than just a restaurant. Word of what had happened spread across the city, and people began coming not just for the food, but for the warmth of a place where everyone was welcome. Maria never changed. She still greeted every customer with a smile. She still served every meal with love. And on some nights, when the restaurant was quiet, Maria would look toward the corner table near the window. She'd think of a man who had walked in looking like the world had forgotten him, and walked out having reminded them all what kindness truly meant. Because the greatest test of humanity isn't how we treat the powerful, but how we care for the powerless.